Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be again here at Fudan. I have to apologize for some typing errors in my manuscript, but I can send you a corrected version. So I will start with a short introduction to the lecture series, but Professor Zhang Shuangli already mentioned that it is based on a series of workshops at Wuppertal, and then the main topic will be Colin Kraut's theory of contemporary capitalism and his critique of socialism. There was a widespread belief in the Western world after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the break-up of the Soviet Union in 1991 that capitalism had won an epochal victory. The inefficiency of the planned economy in the so-called real existing socialism was seen as the main reason for this radical change. For instance, the historian of Eastern Europe, Manfred Hildermeyer, wrote in his 1998 Geschichte der Sowjetunion, History of the Soviet Union, that the demands of technically challenging production were incompatible with the instructing and planning competence of a single party. The establishing, from the end of the 1970s onwards, of a socialist market economy in China was widely regarded in the West as a breakthrough to capitalism. The democratization processes in Eastern Europe and in a series of countries in the global South gave the impression that the worldwide expansion of capitalism and the spread of democracy went hand in hand. A programmatic change in the rich tradition of Western European leftist parties reflected the end of real existing socialism in the Soviet Union and its former satellite states. The Italian Communist Party, for decades the second largest political force in the country, renamed itself the Party of the Democratic Left in 1991. The British Labour Party struck the socialist goal of socialising the means of production from its party manifesto in 1995. The French Socialist Party had relinquished its aim of making a break with capitalism as early as 1983. They had initially and unsuccessfully tried to implement a socialist program after the election of François Mitterrand in 1981. The occasional warnings about the alarming consequences of growing social inequality in capitalist countries in the course of neoliberal globalization found no resonance in the socio-political mainstream. The global economic weight shifted through neoliberal globalization towards former developing countries, especially in East Asia. The outsourcing of productive capacities to these countries, which benefited a considerable part of the population there, was to the detriment of the workforce in Western countries. Already back in 1995, in the face of the Western governing leading elites' inaction concerning the growing social inequality in their countries, Joachim Hirsch expected a renaissance of racist, biologist, ethnocentric, and welfare chauvinistic currents that would set off global political turbulence. In 1998, Richard Rorty predicted the election victory of a strong man yearned for by those who lost out in neoliberal globalization, which would lead to disaster not only in his own country but also worldwide. 2 decades later, this prediction was fulfilled with Donald Trump's presidency. Writing at the same time as Richard Rorty, Ralph Dahrendorf, a prominent Western politician and professor, described the intensification of antagonisms between social classes in capitalist countries under neoliberalism as an elementary danger for democratic form of government. Quote, globalization deprives representative democracy of the economic basis for its only functional domicile hitherto, the nation-state. Globalization damages the cohesiveness of societies, a cohesiveness in which democratic discourse thrives. Globalization replaces democratic institutions with inconsequential communication between atomized individuals. That is a bleak picture, and we must remember in seeing it that the globalization process has its limits. Nevertheless, we can draw the conclusion that development towards globalization and its social consequences abet authoritarian rather than democratic constitutions. End of quote. Western confidence that supposedly some biases between democracy and the capitalist economy had achieved a world historic victory suffered its first serious blow when the use of systematic torture by the US security forces in the so-called War on Terror after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq in violation of international law, which was justified using falsified evidence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, was made public. The public outrage at this illegality meant the French government under Jacques Chirac and the German government under Gerhard Schröder could count on widespread support when they criticized the war on Iraq. The unlawfulness of US actions was then regarded as a moral failure on the part of the government and the members of the security forces. However, in 1995, Joachim Hirsch had already argued that just as before, the relations between nation states were still pervaded with colonial dependency, violence, and war. But without his warning about the potential for violence in neocolonial power structures being publicly heeded. The world financial crisis that erupted in 2008 gave an enduring shock to the belief in the superiority of capitalism and it supposed some biases with democracy. To avert the impending meltdown of the world financial system, capitalist countries rescued faltering banks and large businesses. They did so with previously unimaginable sums of money and at the taxpayers' expense. Long-term cutbacks were made to social services in order to contain the adverse impact of the world financial crisis on the budgets of deeply indebted countries. The profits of the financial sector rapidly reached their old heights again. Jürgen Habermas regarded the world financial crisis as a capitalist system failure. Quote Habermas, "In the autumn of 2008, for the first time in the history of capitalism, the backbone of the world economic system, itself driven by the financial markets, could only be rescued from collapse with the guarantees of the taxpayers." Now I'll skip the next quotation from Pope Francis in order to keep just the 1 hour limit for lecture. The question of sustainability of capitalism, which had seemed settled back in 1991, is being raised anew in Western academic discourse. The thesis that capitalism has a limited lifespan is not peculiar to Marxism. Max Weber wrote in The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that capitalism will probably determine the lives of all individuals who are born into this mechanism until the last ton of fossil fuel is burned. Like Marx and Engels, Weber assumes that capitalism is dependent on constant economic growth for its stability, but that sooner or later this would reach its limits. We have found out in the meantime that if all fossil fuels are used, then a climate catastrophe is unavoidable. Back in 1973, Habermas pointed out that the ongoing global warming since the Industrial Revolution sets limits to the capitalist growth dynamics. Like Habermas, the authors of international renowned anthology Does Capitalism Have a Future?, published in 2013, Immanuel Wallerstein, Randall Collins, Michael Mann, Georgi Delugoyan, and Craig Calhoun saw the world financial crisis as a turning point with a period of still deeper disruptions and transformations possibly ahead. But the authors of this anthology do not agree on whether capitalism is approaching its end. While Wallerstein and Collins are convinced that it has reached a dead end, Mann and Calhoun think it can regenerate if the neoliberal deregulation policy is rolled back through welfare state measures. I can skip also the next part because Professor Zhang-Shuai has already introduced this lecture series. And the same debate also, the same controversy also appeared in the Wuppertal CSO workshops. Nancy Fraser and Wolfgang Strick think the end of capitalism is inevitable. Colin Crouch, Klaus Off, and Josef Vogel have trust in its potential for generation. And now I pass to the main part of my lecture today, Colin Crouch's account of neoliberal capitalism and his critique of socialism. I first present Crouch's impressive explanation for the 2008 world financial crisis, then Crouch's concept of neoliberal post-democracy, which has become an established part of the Western social sciences and public discourse, and finally, the critical discussion at the Wuppertal workshop of his thesis that present crisis of capitalism can be surmounted by a strengthened social democracy and that socialism is not a viable alternative to capitalism. Now, Crouch's explanation of the world financial crisis of 2008. Neoliberalism owes its rise in the 1980s to the economic crisis of the decade before. The latter was characterized by concurrent high inflation and high unemployment. The resulting loss of purchasing power could not have been prevented by the demand-oriented Keynesian economic policy that had dominated Western states since the Second World War. Neoliberalism declared Keynesianism obsolete and relied on the self-healing powers of the market. The privatization of traditional state services and the deregulation of the financial markets were the two core elements of a neoliberal agenda. The cuts to social security imposed by neoliberalism contributed to a reduction in the rate of inflation, but also exacerbated social inequality in Western countries. Neoliberalism sought to re-stimulate economic growth by boosting consumption despite reduced social security. Because of the relocation of productive capacities to low-wage countries, which then included China, the price of consumer goods sank, and at the same time, access to credit was loosened. Crouch characterizes the politically willed dismantling of restrictions and control mechanisms on lending as a privatized Keynesianism. I see this as his groundbreaking contribution to explaining the world financial crisis that erupted in 2008. The expansion of the granting of credit enabled broad sectors of the population with low and middle incomes to make purchases which they would have been previously denied by stricter risk assessment. The credit finance strengthening of mass purchasing power initially made it seem as though the crisis of the 1970s had been overcome. However, the world financial crisis proved this to be an illusion. The easing of the granting of credit did not trigger a surge in productivity in the real economy that would have enabled the repayment of debts. The wage level stagnated for decades. Uncontrolled lending by the banks, which provided them and large corporations with explosive profits, led directly to the world financial crisis. The imminent collapse of the world economic system was staved off by capitalist countries through billions in aid for banks and large corporations at the taxpayer's expense. As Crouch emphasizes in making capitalism fit for society, this made clear the dependence of capitalism on the state to rescue it at public expense from its own contradictions. Contemporary capitalism is characterized by a fundamental contradiction insofar as the free market is no longer in a position to generate the sustainable economic growth that liberal capitalism needs for its stability. Through deals between public officials and corporate representatives, actually existing neoliberalism has in fact massively restricted the freedom of the market that it had propagated. The privatization of state services provided the businesses that took these over with a monopoly and thus a dominant influence on politics. Crouch notes that the state is thereby adapted to the corporation, and this leads to the next topic, Crouch's concept of neoliberal post-democracy. Crouch's concept of post-democracy was coined to describe the erosion of democratic decision-making processes as a result of the neoliberal reorientation of economic policy initiated in the 1970s. In the course of privatizing public services and the establishment of capital-friendly investment conditions, networks of business representations and government actors took control of the management of the economy and policy. The contradiction between neoliberal doctrine, which declares the autonomous dynamic of the free market to be the motor of social prosperity, and the actual results of neoliberal economic policy became clear with the world financial crisis that erupted in 2008. Western governments suspended the laws of the market in the interests of capital by rescuing the banks and businesses that they regarded as systematically important from bankruptcy at the taxpayers' expense. The world financial crisis did not lead to any change in policy. The power of the banks and international businesses remains unbroken, as Crouch states in The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. In The Ascendancy of Finance, Josef Vogel describes, following Crouch's diagnosis of neoliberal post-democracy, the alliance of governmental and financial power that determines the economic policy of capitalist countries even more strongly since the world financial crisis. The central banks play a key role here. Government rescue programs for commercial banks and large corporations in the world financial crisis have allowed state debts to soar. The central banks now see their main task as securing of long-term financing for government debt by commercial banks. They lend money to the commercial banks at historically low interest rates, with which government bonds can be bought at higher interest rates. And Crouch sees the way out from this crisis in the renewal of social democracy. In making capitalism fit for society, Crouch argues that the ominous social consequences and self-destructive tendencies of an uninhibited neoliberalism can only be averted through a revival of social democracy. This should reverse the exacerbation of social inequality that occurred since the neoliberal turn in Western economic policy in the 1980s and broke the original liberal promise that every individual can lead a self-determined life. An active governmental social policy should counter the erosion of social solidarity structures brought about by the expansion of the capitalist market into all areas of life. The neglect of public infrastructure that went with profit-oriented privatization measures adversely affected the long-term functional capacity of the capitalist economy, which then required government intervention. This is also indispensable in the financial economy in order to prevent a repetition of the 2008 world financial crisis. Crouch does, however, concede that present social democratic parties are not up to this task. They have largely adapted to neoliberalism in recent decades. This programmatic pivot can be traced back to the fact that the industrial sector, which had formed the mass basis for traditional social democracy, had shrunk, and trade unions have lost their influence. Crouch hopes for a social democratic surmounting, or at least containment, of neoliberalism on the one hand, through international organizations like the OECD and the International Monetary Fund that have come to see the social divisions and polarization of capitalist countries as a threat to their stability, and on the other hand, through the feminist movement, because women are far more affected by erosion of social solidarity structures and precarious working and living conditions than men. In a contribution to the Author Meets Discussants workshop with Crouch at Wuppertal in 2018, Regina Kreide raised far-reaching objections to Crouch's view that neoliberal post-democracy can be overcome by a strengthened social democracy. Kreide's critical points are directed at Crouch not having called the capitalist system to question on a fundamental level. On his view, social democracy should reform capitalism but without touching its foundations. Kreide first points out that contemporary financial capitalism is in an enduring crisis. economic growth is decreasing, social inequality is increasing, the burden of debt has reached alarming proportions. What Crider finds lacking in Crouch are concrete proposals as to how social democracy can master this problem within the framework of the present capitalist system. This raises the question of whether capitalism has a future at all. Crouch justifies his positive answer by saying the capitalist market economy is superior to all socialist forms of the economy. Crider objects to Crouch's standpoint, saying that he all too hastily equates the market economy with capitalism. Forms of the economy are conceivable in which private ownership of the means of production, which is a defining feature of capitalism, steps into the background in favor of cooperative ownership, with the exchange of goods continuing to take place in the market. Crouch's trust in the sustainability of capitalism is, according to Crider, also over-hasty because he nowhere considers the thesis that with a combination of persistent economic stagnation and decreased social inequality, capitalism has entered its final stages. According to Crider, only democratic socialism offers a way out of the present economic, ecological, and social crisis, as well as out of neoliberal post-democracy. A new narrative is needed to get it off the ground. This must address the protection of the environment, gender relations, and racist discrimination in the predominant capitalism to a much greater extent than traditional forms of socialism. Crider finds points of connection for a new socialist narrative in Thomas Piketty, Naomi Klein, Robert Selig, and Cedric Robinson, amongst others. Now the next topic, Crouch's critique of socialism. At the beginning of his book, Making Capitalism Fit for Society, Colin Crouch writes, quote, "The collapse of the Soviet Union made it clear, if it was not already, that capitalism is the only complex system known to us that can provide an efficient and innovative economy." End of quote. He deduces from this contention the impossibility and indeed undesirability of the old socialist project of trying to transcend capitalism. Crouch points out, however, that the so-called actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union stands diametrically opposite to its originating idea at many points. This provides the occasion for a question. If the idea of socialism in the Soviet Union was distorted, then how can one infer from its collapse that the socialist project in general is not feasible? In order to find an answer to this question in Crouch's Making Capitalism Fit for Society, we must first of all clarify to what extent the alleged socialism in the Soviet Union was diametrically opposed to its originating idea. Crouch characterizes the socialist movement saying that they are seeking entirely to replace the capitalist economy and markets by a system of common ownership, meaning either the state or a cooperative arrangement. In the Soviet Union at the end of the 1920s, after the turn from new economic policy, which had contained some elements of a market economy, the economy was managed by the state. However, the Soviet economic and state organization was not a system of common ownership because economic decisions were taken by a class of officials who thereby provided themselves with material privileges. The Communist Party officials secured their power through state repression. This stands in stark contradiction to the original idea of socialism. According to Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, in socialism, class oppositions dissolve into a social association, quote, where the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all, end of quote. In his writings, Anti-Düring in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels has introduced the concept of state capitalism in order to designate a developmental tendency he predicted in capitalist societies. Engels argues that contemporary liberal capitalism would sooner or later get into a hopeless systematic crisis that would compel the state to take over the direction of production. By doing so in the framework of capitalist society, the state will become, to quote Engels, the total capitalist. In his 1941 article, State Capitalism, Its Possibilities and Limitations, Friedrich Pollock characterized the then Soviet Union as state capitalist. In the Marxist tradition, as in Pollock, state capitalism is distinguished on the one hand from liberal capitalism, which is based on giving free rein to market forces, and socialism on the other. Accordingly, the concept of state capitalism has both an economic and social political dimension. With respect to its economic dimension, state planning and management restrict and in extreme cases completely repeal market mechanisms. With regard to the social political dimension, under state capitalism, economics and politics are dominated by a ruling class that secures material privileges for itself. The social political aspect is crucial to distinguishing state capitalism from socialism. The central control of economic processes is, for Marx and Engels, a defining characteristic of socialism, but they also insist economic planning should not lie in the hands of state authorities, but in a democratically constituted society. In Capital, Marx emphasizes the role of planning processes in socialism, and Engels in Anti-Düring and Socialism Utopian and Scientific. Marx strongly advocates the democratization of public governments on the Jewish question. For this, Engels coins the memorable phrase about the withering away of the state as a political authority in socialism. Against this background, Kraut's point of view that the collapse of the Soviet Union proves that the socialist project is impossible can be explained in a way that his argument is divided into two steps. In the first step, he infers from the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Soviet economic and social system was dysfunctional in the long term. This system was, however, as Kraut himself emphasizes, not socialist in the original sense, which is equivalent to saying that it was state capitalist. In the first step of his argument, Kraut thus establishes the thesis that the failure of the Soviet Union shows that the Soviet type of state capitalism was inefficient in the long term. In order to conclude that the socialist project is possible, Kraut must implicitly bring into play the premise that state capitalism constitutes a necessary transitional stage to socialism. This, then, is the second step of his argument. The first step of Kraut's argument is convincing. In his History of the Soviet Union, Manfred Hildermeyer describes the Soviet planned economy at the end of the 1970s as irredeemable dysfunctional. Mikhail Gorbachev's attempt to establish a socialist market economy was motivated by the persistent stagnation into which it had fallen. But the Soviet planned economy had had decades of success. During the first two 5-year plans from 1929 to 1937, the gross national product per capita tripled through forced industrialization, albeit at a high price. The forced collectivization of agriculture, implemented through repression, accompanied a push forward towards industrialization and led to a serious famine in 1932-33. While the average income under Stalin did not keep pace with economic growth, the general standard of living noticeably increased in the 2 decades after his death in 1953. Hildermeyer explains the fact that the central planning of the Soviet economy precipitated the leap into industrial age, but fell into enduring crisis in the 1970s by arguing that central economic planning was indeed capable of mobilizing resources for industrialization that were lying idle in a predominantly agrarian society. But because it constricted the required spontaneity and creativity, central planning ran up against unsurmountable obstacles as soon as technological innovations became indispensable for sustained economic growth. This is in line with Kraut's view that the Soviet Union failed due to a lack of potential for economic innovation, although Hildermeyer does not just cite economic grounds for its dissolution. The second step in Kraut's argument, the thesis that state capitalism is the historical precondition for socialism, accords with Engels' standpoint. According to Engels, state capitalism holds in itself the formal means for a socialist solution, as it diminishes the power of the capitalist entrepreneurs. In socialism, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. But even if one goes along with the two aforementioned steps in Kraut's argument, an explanatory gap remains. He implicitly introduces the premise that Gorbachev's attempt to transform the planned economy into a socialist market economy was doomed to failure. In my eyes, this premise is not convincing. China became an economic and political world power through its transition to a socialist market economy, which was programmatically established in 1992. In order to be able to maintain his thesis that capitalism is the only complex system known to us that can provide an efficient and innovative economy, Kraut has to make use of a further premise, that the official designation of the present Chinese economic system as a socialist market economy is in fact wrong, and it is actually capitalist. I do not agree with Kraut's view, but will not go into detail now. In the following, I will focus on two questions. The first, why did Gorbachev's attempt to establish democratic socialism in the Soviet Union fail? And second, is there a chance to transform the neoliberal post-democracy in the Western world that is a peculiar type of state capitalism into a democratic socialism? Now the first question. Can the collapse of the Soviet Union be seen as a proof of the hopelessness of the socialist project? Hildermeyer's interpretation of its collapse is close to Kraut's in that he too sees the main reason for this in the long-term inefficiency of a planned economy. But he also uses two further factors to explain the failure of Gorbachev's attempt to reform the Soviet Union through democratization processes and the transition to a socialist market economy. The first, the secessionist endeavors in several constituent republics, especially in the Baltic and the Caucasus, that were efficacious as a result of the democratization process initiated by Gorbachev. And the second, the delegitimization of the Soviet Union's normative self-description as a socialist state. Since the de-Stalinization under Khrushchev, there had been a broad consensus among the party leadership that the state terror that had prevailed since the mid-30s threatened to paralyze the population, and that their acceptance of the dominant system, which still had repressive features, should henceforth be achieved by raising the general standard of living. From the late 1950s up to 1970s, so-called real existing socialism was justified by exponents by claiming that it was economically superior to the capitalist market anarchy, as would be proven in the foreseeable future. This assertion lost all credibility in the 1980s. As a result, the enduring crisis of the Soviet planned economy, Hildermeyer claimed, widened to a creeping decline in legitimacy of the overall order. Hildermeyer's and Kraut's view that Gorbachev's reform politics was doomed to fail, however, is by no means universally shared in international research on history of the Soviet Union. In his monograph, Revolutionary Russia, Orlando Figes, a leading historian of the history of the Soviet Union, disputes that the Soviet Union dissolved due to economic problems that were incapable of being solved within a socialist order. Although the economy stagnated in the 1980s after continual growth in the decade before, the economic crisis fell short by far of the dimensions of the Great Depression in the Western world after Black Friday in 1928. Economic and social catastrophe in Russia was first brought about by Boris Yeltsin's neoliberal politics. Hyperinflation left large parts of the population impoverished. Foreign trade fell by half. Life expectancy sank by several years. A speculative bubble that the Yeltsin administration had allowed, even encouraged, led to the insolvency of the Russian state in August 1998. Figes describes how the Soviet Union unraveled from the top. Because of Gorbachev's decision not to provide military support to the communist regimes in Eastern Europe during the people's protests, these regimes were no longer able to suppress the democracy movements in their countries and had to yield in 1989. This helped the independence movements in the Baltic, Moldavia, Georgia, and Armenia to finally break through. However, This by no means sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. In March 1991, the majority of the citizens in 9 of the total 16 republics of the Soviet Union, among them Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, voted to preserve the Union. Notably, roughly 94% of the citizens of the Soviet Union lived in these 9 republics. However, after the failed putsch against Gorbachev in August 1991, the presidents of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, Yeltsin, Shushkevich, and Kravchuk, declared that their republics were withdrawing from the Union in open disregard of the referendum. Although the Soviet constitution had granted the member republics the right to leave their union, Yeltsin, Shushkevich, and Kravchuk were in no way authorized to implement this step on their own initiative. Hildermeyer's assumption that the secessionist endeavors had a decisive part in the failure of Gorbachev's reform politics is thus implausible. The outcome of the March 1991 referendum shows that his politics were not substantially threatened by these secessionist endeavors. Fajr stresses that the dissolution of the Soviet Union did not change anything in the real power structures in Russia. The majority of politicians and successful businessmen in Yeltsin's Russia had been part of the Soviet nomenklatura. And when state property was privatized, they acquired the majority of the shares and of the businesses at rock-bottom prices and were thus able to maintain their oligarchic status. Georgy Delugrian argues that nomenklatura brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union in order to save its privileges that were threatened by Gorbachev's political reforms. Under the heading of glasnost, transparency, Gorbachev's attempt to break up nomenclatura's clientelism and to enforce specialist qualifications as key criterion for job placement. According to Delugrian, the Soviet functionaries feared that their better educated, energetic younger subalterns were bound to unseat the seniors if open discussion and competition were allowed. For this reason, the majority of the nomenklatura supported Yeltsin's blocking of Gorbachev's glasnost campaign by dissolving the Soviet Union. In his book, Establishment of Capitalism in Russia, Felix Jaitner cites a statement by Yeltsin as unequivocal evidence that he had allied himself with parts of the old Soviet power apparatus against Gorbachev. He had seen, Yeltsin said, that the new Russia would have to be buttressed by the legacy of a Khrushchev-Brezhnev period. Arch-Getty and Oleg Naumov also see nomenklatura's efforts to secure their privileges as the main reason for Gorbachev's failure. They draw a parallel between this and the fall of Khrushchev, who had unsuccessfully tried to limit the terms of party functionaries. Getty's and Naumov's description of the oligarchic power structures in the successor states to the Soviet Union is consistent with Fajr's, Delugrian, and Jaitner's analysis. Quote, "The nomenklatura survived socialism and did in fact inherit the country. Its cohesion, connections, and experience were sufficient to allow its members to become not only the new governing elite of the 1990s, but the legal owners of the country, assets, and property." End of quote. On account of the disastrous social consequences of his neoliberal economic policies, when Yeltsin ran for Russia's presidency again in 1996, the Communist Party candidate, the Russian Federation, Gennady Zyuganov, initially led by a wide margin in the opinion polls. Yeltsin owed his re-election first and foremost to the campaign against Zyuganov, run by the most influential media groups, owned by the oligarchs who had amassed unimaginable wealth through Yeltsin's privatization policies. The fact that the victory of the communist candidate can only be prevented through this media campaign and the network of former nomenklatura members allied with Yeltsin calls into question Hildermeyer's thesis of an irreversible decline in legitimacy of Soviet socialism since the late 1980s. There is thus reason to believe that during Gorbachev's term in office, there was a real possibility of establishing a socialist market economy under democratic conditions in the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union thus cannot be taken as proof of the impossibility, indeed undesirability, of the socialist project of trying to present capitalism as Crouch contends. In concluding part of my talk, I want to outline the similarities between present-day Western neoliberalism and the state capitalism envisaged by Engels and indicate a possible socialist way out. Crouch's observation that the state in the neoliberal era is adapted to the corporation comes close to Engels' assessment of the role of the bourgeois state in the systematic crisis of market-based capitalism that he is expecting. The state comes on stage, according to Engels, as an essentially capitalist machine managing economic processes in order to maintain the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production, serving primarily the interests of the owners of capital. But here a shift of weight must be kept in view. While Engels assumed that the state would have to take charge of the production, the financial sector is the console center of neoliberalism. The state capitalist feature taken on by actual post-democratic alliances between public officials and corporate representatives is cemented by the structural as well as personal interconnection of the central banks with the financial markets, which are dominated by large companies. And this is accompanied by severe losses in public investment and social benefits. Josef Vogel speaks of a class war waged by an alliance of state and financial powers against the rest of the population. This recalls Engels' words that the state, acting as a capitalist machine, primarily serves the interests of a band of coupon cutters. Neoliberalism is not in a position to provide an enduring solution to the crisis in demand, a crisis to which its oath is assent. The historically low interest rates with which the central banks have sought to prevent a recession since the world financial crisis and which make the buying of government bonds more palatable to the commercial banks are at the expense of future pensions. This means that old age poverty is pre-programmed for broad sections of the population. The digitalization of the professional world will drive up unemployment. Given the predictable decrease in purchasing power, I am convinced that a return to market-centered liberal capitalism is out of the question. The delegitimization of the actual existing neoliberalism has become obvious through recent successes of the populist attacks on the established elites. Right-wing populism wants to at least partly reverse a key element of capitalist modernization, namely the globalization of the economy. It lays claims to the idea of social justice for itself, but limits it to the people of a state, excluding ethnic minorities. What, on the other hand, could be a socialist way out of actually existing neoliberalism look like? In my view, Engels' thesis that state capitalism provides a formal means for a socialist solution is still relevant. Crouch stresses that there is no going back behind the market-dominating positions of large corporations. He advocates a strengthening of civil society as a countervailing power. However, in my view, this has only hope of success if the de facto fusion of politics and economics is subjected to social control, through a fundamental shift of state monetary policy and change of property relations. The monopolization of credit creation by the central banks is to be attributed a key role here. This was called for by the US economist Irving Fisher in the Great Depression of the 1930s. After the world financial crisis, Fisher's idea was updated by Hans Christoph Binswanger with the aim of getting out of capitalist compulsion to growth that is presently running on empty. Binswanger emphasizes that the monopolization of credit creation by the central bank amounts to the end of stock markets. This puts the axe to the root of Western capitalism which has been dominated by joint stock companies for 150 years. A socialist transformation of actually existing neoliberalism can start from its state capitalist features. To this end, the economic management presently exercised by a post-democratic alliance of state officials and corporate representatives must be transferred over to public administration that is itself subject to democratic control. And this goal can in turn only be achieved when large companies, which are a central economic and political power in globalized capitalism, are transferred to cooperative or public ownership. Post-capitalist forms of economy and society are being envisaged in current Western social theory under the headings of commons economics, democratic planning, and market socialism. Whether promising political programs can be derived from this remains to be seen. In my opinion, we must leave the question of whether socialism has a future in the West open for the time being. I have tried to make it plausible that the future of socialism is not a primarily economic issue, but also and above a question of political will. This corresponds to Wolfgang Streeck's position in his article, Whose Side We Are On, in the anthology Reflections on the Future of the West. At the core of the socialist agenda is, according to Streeck, quote, the overall confrontation between capitalism as a socially destructive political economic order and society as organized by left socialist politics. Thank you for your attention.